I think that anti-Zionism is a much greater threat to American Jewry than it is to Israel.
Hello, I'm Jonathan Tobin, editor-in-chief of the Jewish News Syndicate, JNS.org, and you're listening to Top Story, a weekly podcast where I analyze the most important stories happening in Jewish news around the world. Each week, I will break down politics, foreign policy, and culture to provide insights into what is going on behind the headlines. Hello, and welcome to Top Story. In the more than 28 years since the Oslo Accords first raised hopes that peace was possible, and then within a few years destroyed them, it seems as if much of the discussion about the Jewish state in American and American Jewish forums has remained locked in old, tired arguments that have been endlessly repeated for decades. But the current stalemate, largely caused by the same spirit of Palestinian intransigence that has fueled their century-long war on Zionism, leaves us asking, what is the path forward for a Jewish state that is confronted by this seemingly insoluble problem? If, as the overwhelming majority of Israeli voters understand, that any talk of a two-state solution or peace is off the table for the foreseeable future, is there nevertheless a path to coexistence between Jews and their Arab neighbors? Does the decision of an Israeli Arab political party, and one that is Islamist and anti-Zionist in nature, to join an Israeli governing political coalition this past year, an indication of a sea change in favor of rational solutions to the conflict? Or does the anti-Jewish violence from the Arab community in mixed cities like Lod an indication that radicalism and rejection of the reality of Israel is growing? The same questions can be asked about Jewish-Muslim relations in the United States, as the loudest and most prominent voices purporting to represent the latter are groups like CAIR, the Traffic in Anti-Semitism. Just as important, what do the answers to these questions portend for efforts to combat Jew hatred at a time when anti-Semitism is clearly on the rise on both ends of the political spectrum, especially as left-wing delegitimization of Zionism is not only gaining traction in the public square, but among young Jews? And how does the undermining of what was once considered to be a bipartisan consensus in support of Israel impact the Jewish state's view of the diaspora, as well as its efforts to rally support in America for security issues like the Iranian nuclear threat? To discuss these questions, we're privileged to have with us one of the leading figures of contemporary Jewish letters, as well as a keen commentator on Israeli society and the question of interfaith dialogue. Yossi Klein Halevi is Senior Fellow of the Shalom Hartman Institute and co-director of its Muslim Leadership Initiative, as well as co-host of the Institute's For Heaven's Sake podcast. He is the award-winning author of several important books: Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor, Like Dreamers, the story of the Israeli paratroopers who reunited Jerusalem and divided a nation, At the Entrance to the Garden of Eden, A Jew's Search for God with Christians and Muslims in the Holy Land, and Memoirs of a Jewish Extremist. An important commentator on Israeli society and politics, his work appears on the op-ed pages of leading American newspapers. A native of New York, he's lived in Israel since 1982. Yossi Klein Halevi, welcome to Top Story.
Good to be with you, Jonathan.
Yossi, it's great to see you. I want to start by asking you your opinion about the current Israeli government. About 17 years or more ago, you were one of the first voices to point out that it was time for Israelis and supporters of Israel to stop debating the conflict with the Palestinians as if it were 1987 or 1993 and to instead confront reality. It's taken a while for Israel's political alignment to start to resemble that analysis, because although clearly a large majority of Israeli voters cast their ballots for parties that have right-wing positions on the conflict, 2 years ago the key divide ceased being about the Palestinians and instead focused on whether or not to keep Benjamin Netanyahu as prime minister. The eventual result of that very different stalemate was, after 4 elections, the creation of a coalition of right-wing, left-wing, centrist, and even an Arab party united only in their loathing of Netanyahu and unable probably to do much else. At the time that government led by Naftali Bennett and Yair Lapid took office, you saw it as a sign of hope. More than 6 months later, are you still hopeful? And if so, why?
I think the hope has fulfilled itself. this government, it's interesting that you're linking it to what I felt at the beginning of the Second Intifada in the early 2000s, which is that both the approach of the left and the right had reached a dead end, and it was time for the emergence of an Israeli center. And my understanding of the center, in particular on the Palestinian issue, is a combination of the insights of left and right. The insights of the left are that in order to preserve Israel as a Jewish and democratic state, we must try to reach a deal with the Palestinians. And the insight of the right is we can't reach a deal with the Palestinians. And so those are the two conclusions of the two intifadas. You know, I was drafted into the IDF in the first intifada, and my experience was the occupation is a disaster for Israel. And then my experience in the second intifada, raising 3 children in the middle of suicide bombings, was there's no chance for peace. And so what if you can't occupy and you can't make peace, you need to manage the conflict. And this government is committed to managing the conflict. And it's interesting, Jonathan, because if you know, when you were describing the makeup of this government, it really hit me very strongly that in its aggregate, this is a centrist government. It's got a right wing, it's got a left wing, it even has an Islamist wing, you know? and it has an anti-Arab wing, Lieberman. You know, I mean, it's such an ingathering of Israel's contradictions, but the mistake that I feel both left and right have made over the years is in trying to force a resolution to some of Israel's problems that are insoluble and some of Israel's problems which shouldn't be resolved. For example, the tension between Israel as a Jewish and democratic state, which this government is committed to holding, however uneasily. But that's not, there's no way to resolve definitively those identity contradictions and the contradictions in the policy issues we face, for example, on the Palestinians, without totally tearing apart Israeli society. And so, with no other choice, this really is the very best we can hope for.
All right. Well, that is as hopeful as I suppose one can get when speaking about Israeli governments. Let me broaden the lens a little bit for a moment. A year ago, you co-wrote a piece in The Atlantic with your former Shalem Center colleague, Michael Oren, about the former Israeli ambassador in the United States and historian, about the danger of the U.S. returning to the Iran nuclear deal under President Biden. Mm-hmm. As it turns out, the Iranians weren't so easily lured back into the deal and have now escalated their nuclear efforts. And it appears as if the United States may be willing to accept Iranian acceptance of an even weaker nuclear pact that will probably make an Iranian nuclear weapon even more of an inevitability. That's something that a political consensus in Israel regards as an existential threat. Can you see a path where the current Israeli government, which is trying to avoid a confrontation with Biden, and to repeat what happened with Netanyahu, to avoid a break with the United States on this issue?
Ultimately, no, because we're on a collision course with this government, the Biden government, and the fundamental question on Iran was always the same, and that is, what is your worst case scenario? Is it Iran getting a bomb, or is it a preemptive military strike to prevent Iran from getting a bomb? The Israeli answer is clear. Our worst case scenario is Iran getting a bomb. The worst case scenario, it seems to me, of this administration is a military strike. And that was certainly the attitude of the Obama administration, and that's how we got to that disastrous deal in the first place. And just to recap, because there's a lot of revisionist thinking going on now about the deal, and there's this retroactive glorification of the deal. This was the best deal we could have gotten. What that deal did, in essence, was get Iran to delay nuclear breakout in exchange for two extraordinary Iranian victories. The first was that if you look at the trajectory of the deal, Iran would be guaranteed at some point in the not too distant future to break out into nuclear capability. And that's because of the sunset clauses and because the nuclear deal left Iran on the nuclear threshold. It didn't dismantle the infrastructure.
Just to explain to our listeners and viewers, the sunset clauses basically means that the deal expires. All the restrictions on them will expire, and quite frankly, very close now because it expires at the end of this decade.
Yes, and the other unbelievable American concession to Iran was that in exchange for Iran agreeing not to abandon its nuclear ambitions, but simply to defer them, in the interim until Iran would break out as a nuclear power, it would meanwhile achieve international legitimacy for its hegemony in the Middle East, in the Arab world. And it would achieve that with this enormous infusion of foreign aid, funds, trade agreements. Iran would become a wealthy country. And so it would get the best of both worlds. It would be a conventional power, the conventional power in the Muslim Middle East, until that time when it would saunter across the nuclear line and become a nuclear power. That's supposedly the deal that we're supposed to be aspiring to. If you pay attention to what the Israeli government is saying, they're saying we would welcome a good deal on Iran. Now, the Biden administration, I think, is interpreting that as Israeli acquiescence to a return to the 2015 deal or some minor modification of the deal. That's not at all what Israel is saying. We're saying we do not accept the 2015 deal. We still do not accept that. That was a disaster. And we certainly won't accept 2015 minus, which here I very much agree with your analysis, Jonathan. I think the Biden administration is heading toward 2015 minus. And so on Iran, I find myself, as I have been really for many years, on the far hawkish side of this issue. And I think events are only vindicating that position.
Yeah, I think to me, I arrive at my analysis because it seems this administration, like the Obama administration, which many of the current people serving under Biden are alumni of the Obama administration, for them diplomacy
especially on the Iran deal, by the way. The Iran team,
Robert Malley,
Obama's team.
Wendy Sherman, team. Yes, right, all of them. And for them, diplomacy is an end of itself. And I think you're quite right. Their worst case scenario is a strike, either by the United States or Israel, on Iran. So just a quick follow-up is, can Israel live with Iran being a nuclear threshold state rather than one that has gone all the way over? Is there some way that Biden and Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State, can finesse this to get them to agree, get the Israeli government to agree to any deal?
Look, Michael Oren had another piece that he wrote a few weeks ago. I don't know if you saw it. It was a very important piece in the Times of Israel, where he pinpointed the precise difference between the Israeli approach and the American approach. The Americans all along have been saying, we are committed to preventing Iran from attaining a nuclear bomb. That's not the Israeli approach. The Israeli red line is we are committed to preventing Iran from reaching the nuclear threshold, from having the capability to produce a bomb. Now, we're very close to that. And the reason for this nuance, this difference, which may not seem like a major difference to outsiders. But for us, it's the difference between living with unbearable, permanent existential threat, allowing the Iranians to determine the pace of their nuclear breakout, and keeping us in permanent suspension, or ensuring that Iran doesn't come close to the threshold. That's the difference. We were not on the same page with the Obama administration on that distinction, and we're not on the same page with Biden.
Right. One of the issues that you've written about is the way that opponents of Israel have sought to criminalize the Jewish state in international forums, an effort that seems to have escalated since the fighting with Hamas last May. That's about to get another major push at the UN, with an open-ended investigation of Israel being sponsored by its Human Rights Council. Last May, you wrote in the Los Angeles Times that this ought to lead Israel to make another start at a peace initiative in order to maintain its place on the moral high ground that, despite numerous efforts to foster a compromise, have been rejected in the past by both the Palestinian leadership and the Palestinian political culture that supports them. Is this still a viable stand in the face of the reality of a Palestinian Authority and its Hamas rivals, who seem incapable of contemplating anything actual peace, even after the Abraham Accords seems to have shown that much of the Arab world is sick of their intransigence?
Yeah. I think the Abraham Accords is an historic turning point, and may be a historic turning point ultimately in our relations with the Palestinians, because the Palestinians may have no choice. The Palestinians are losing their support system. They lost the Soviet Union, the Soviet bloc. That was the first major blow, and that led them to the Oslo process. That, along with the first Gulf War, and now the Oslo process was a fraud. It was an Arafat attempt to pretend. It was a pretend peace process. Nevertheless, I think that without the Oslo process, and this isn't something that I would have said before the Abraham Accords, but I think that one positive outcome of Oslo were the Abraham Accords. I think that one has to see that there is a momentum that's been built over the years. It began with the Egyptian-Israeli peace agreement, and Menachem Begin was bitterly condemned by his right-wing opponents then. And today, I think almost all Israelis would agree that the Egyptian-Israeli agreement, however high a price we paid, put Israel on an entirely different security footing. It ended the phenomenon of conventional existential wars, which was the pattern 48, 67, 73. All our wars since then have been asymmetrical. Israel fighting terror groups. None of those wars in and of themselves have been an existential. One can certainly argue that cumulatively, all of these asymmetrical conflicts are existential. But the Egyptian-Israeli agreement, which led to Oslo, which led to the Abraham Accords, so that even though Arafat tried to trick us into a false peace, I think that there were some long-term positive results that came out of that. And my Rebbe, my teacher in the question of Arab-Israeli peace was someone named Yehoshaphat Harkabi. Yehoshaphat Harkabi was this legendary head of military intelligence in the 1950s. Was known as a hawk. He was the one who exposed the Palestinian National Covenant, the Stages Plan, all of those, the PLO ideological infrastructure for that really was behind Arafat's deceptive peace process. But at the same time, Harkabi had a concept which really shaped the way I think about this conflict. And what he said was, of course, the Arabs will try to trick us into a false peace process, get as much territory from us as possible, and then not deliver peace. He said, but we could actually, he didn't quite use the word trick, but he said we could actually lure the Arabs into he called it a web of peace, in which there will be a momentum of international legitimacy for a peace process. And eventually, Arab nations that didn't intend to make peace with us will find themselves stuck in a peace agreement. I think one can make the case that that's been true for Egypt. And even though it has not played out with the Palestinians, I would argue that the Abraham Accords owe something to this infrastructure of peace, even false peace, that was created. And so, if you were to ask me whether I believe that there's any chance for an agreement between Israel and the Palestinians today, my answer is absolutely not. Even if the far left, if the Meretz party were in sole control of the Israeli government today, it would not bring peace. We don't have a partner on the other side yet. But the ground is shifting. And my approach to peacemaking with the Palestinians is based on several premises. The first is that as the occupier, and I use occupation in a very specific way. I don't believe we are occupiers in any part of the land of Israel, but we are occupiers of another people. We're ruling over another people. And in being in that situation, we are not just, we are first of all morally bound to try to keep probing for possibilities of peace, but more than that, in terms of our self-interest, we need to keep reestablishing our moral credibility, our high ground, not among our enemies, not among the delegitimizers. I don't care about them. Among our friends in Congress, within the American Jewish community, where we're losing so much ground. We need to keep reminding our friends that we are not the rejectionists here. And so for those reasons, I believe that we need to keep the initiative going. And finally, I take a pasuk, a verse in the Torah about peace very seriously. Bakesh shalom verodfehu. Seek peace and pursue it. That's a very strange verse. Why not just seek peace? Why also pursue it? And my understanding as applied to the Palestinian issue is you seek peace when it's possible and you pursue peace when it's not. And peace is not possible now with the Palestinians. But we still have the responsibility to our own self-interest, no less than to the moral imperative, to keep trying to pursue peace.
Interesting. You're a little, you've said, and I think it's, unassailable that the current situation makes an agreement, even between Meretz and Mahmoud Abbas, impossible. Certainly, he recently met with Defense Minister Benny Gantz in his home inside Israel, and certainly then, right afterwards, gave the speech at the annual, the anniversary of the first, Fatah terrorist activity. And I even noted in a piece in Haaretz, Amir Ahas, who's their, Israeli-Palestinian correspondent, that he invited about 100 Palestinian intellectuals to his headquarters right after the meeting with Gantz, and they thought they were going to get an update about possible peace or possible something, and instead he lectured them about how Ashkenazi Jews are descended from the Khazars and not really Jews, which I would imagine even some of them thought was pretty crazy. But you're a bit better connected than I think a lot of the people who comment on this. Is there an alternative to Abbas, even in the foreseeable future somehow, that would make you think that the pursuit will be more than just an exercise in, morality rather than something tangible?
I don't even think Palestinians can give you an answer to that question. But when you talk about Mahmoud Abbas, there's another Abbas that I think is much more interesting and important, and that, of course, is Mansour Abbas, the head of the Ra'am party that's part of the Israeli governing coalition. And what's really interesting about Mansour Abbas is that even as Mahmoud Abbas is telling Palestinian intellectuals that the Jews aren't Jews and there's no such thing as the Jews and the Jewish state is a crime and a historical distortion, you have the head of Israel's Islamist party declaring not just to a Jewish audience, but he actually made this statement first in Arabic, in an Arabic newspaper, that Israel was born as a Jewish state and it will remain a Jewish state. We've never heard that from any major Arab Israeli politician, let alone a Palestinian leader. And so something really powerful is happening here. And Jonathan, one of the great ironies about this moment for us is that even as much of the Arab siege against Israel is cracking and the Arab war against Israel's legitimacy is starting to unravel, the siege against Israel is rising in the progressive West. And that's and the campaign against Israel is actually shifting to the West.
Yeah. In your role at the Shalom Hartman Institute, as well as your 2018 book, Letters to a Palestinian Neighbor, you've been a leading advocate for Jewish-Muslim dialogue in both Israel and the United States. Looking first to Israel, you've written movingly about the responses to your book from Palestinians as a sign of hope, even if a lot of what they said in response seemed to confirm that the conflict is intractable and perhaps insoluble. It's been 3.5 years since that book was published. Can you tell us what you've learned about the subject since then from those responses?
Well, it's interesting because I've been involved. I've lived in Israel now. This is my 40th year. I'm celebrating my 40th anniversary. It's a big biblical number, 40. And I've been involved in one way or another with this conflict. I've lived this conflict for at least 40 years. And so there's very little left to learn when you've been so immersed. You don't really hear new arguments. Oh, wow, why didn't I ever think of that before? It's all been said, and we just regurgitate. And, sometimes I think that you could wake up those of us who've been involved in this issue on both sides. You can wake us up in the middle of the night, and we could not only deliver a 2-hour spontaneous defense of our own side's narrative, but we could also role play the other side's narrative. It's right. Just it's all there. What I did learn was first of all that the despair among young Palestinians is actually in some ways deeper than their anger. The anger is very strong. The despair is greater. And I had underestimated the despair because that was, when I think about my generation of Palestinians, there was no despair. There was just rage. And also a great sense on their part of ultimate victory. My generation of Palestinians believed one way or another they were going to win. This generation of Palestinians does not believe that. And despair can go in different ways. It can lead to terrible atrocities. It could lead to defeat. It's wide open. It could lead to accommodation. So it's a very delicate transitional moment in the conflict, and that's one thing that I've learned from very moving and difficult conversations that I've had with groups of young Palestinians who were responding to my book. And the book is available in Arabic as well. I put it online in Arabic for free downloading. And thousands of Arabic speakers have downloaded the book. And I've gotten hundreds of responses, not only from Palestinians, but from all over the Arab world. I mean, the book was reviewed in Saudi Arabia's leading news weekly. They gave the book, this is a book defending Zionism, and they gave the book a two-page positive review. Much better review, by the way, than the New York Times gave the book. So going back to what we were saying earlier about the war against Israel shifting from the Middle East to the progressive West, I've experienced it, and look, a lot of the responses that I got to the book from Palestinians in particular were hostile. There were some death threats, but that was completely expected. What I didn't expect was this outpouring of very thoughtful, long responses, arguing with me, sometimes passionately, but at the same time, respectfully and grateful that an Israeli, after 100 years of conflict, someone on our side finally decided to try to explain who we are and what we're actually doing here. It's no one on our side has ever tried to make that case. And I believe very strongly in taking our case to the other side and not being all, as we usually are, in a defensive mode. We're always responding to attacks. And this book was an attempt to make the case for Zionism to the most difficult audience possible for this story. And what I learned is that it's possible to do. There are people who, for all the difficulties, will listen, will argue, but engage. And that's all I was trying to do. This book was an experiment. And I didn't have any grandiose dreams of bringing peace even a millimeter closer. That was not my goal here. My goal was to see whether we could have a conversation about our conflicting narratives. And I don't know where it's going to lead. I don't know who will be moved or influenced on the other side. Maybe no one. Maybe nothing will change. On the other hand, the only tool that I have is my writing. And that's my responsibility. And so I tried to fulfill that.
Right. At the time that Letters to a Palestinian Neighbor was published, I wrote in JNS that the most important audience for what you wrote was among young American Jews who needed to learn about the two conflicting narratives about the conflict, especially since so many of them still seem so ignorant of the facts about it or even much about the history and importance of Zionism.
First of all, I really appreciated your review. I remember it well. And I remember that you noted that this book would be useful for young American Jews, and that's definitely played out. And the truth is, I had two audiences in mind when I wrote the book. The first were my Palestinian neighbors, but the second, no less important for me, was I was hoping young American Jews would eavesdrop on the conversation. And initially, I thought of writing a second book called Letters to a Young American Jew.
I think your friend Hillel Halkin did that like 50 years ago, right?
He did. And I thought of doing a kind of update. Nobody would have read a book with that title, Letters to a Young American Jew. It's not, when Hillel wrote that book in the late 70s, there was an audience. Today, I don't know who would read a book with that title. And so in the end, I felt that much of what I was trying to say to my Palestinian neighbor about Zionism and Jewish peoplehood and the Jewish return home could also be useful for young American Jews. In terms of your question, I'm worried about two things in terms of young American Jews. I'm worried about this the spreading poison of anti-Zionism among young, committed liberal Jews from the liberal denominations. We saw it with the letter of of 80 or 90 rabbinical students from the Reform and Conservative movements during the most recent Gaza war. What worries me is that not that anti-Zionism is going to become a mainstream position among young American Jews. I don't think that's going to happen. But it already in some sense is becoming a legitimate position within the core of the future leadership of liberal American Jewry. And this, to my mind, is a catastrophe, first of all, for the liberal denominations, because it's going to make it impossible for there to be a real relationship between Israel and these denominations. Now, I'm a very deep critic of how Israel has treated the non-Orthodox denominations over the years, gratuitously insulting the Jewish commitment and the love of Judaism of large numbers of American Jews. I'm ashamed, and I feel that that's a deeply anti-Zionist act, because Zionism promised to create a public space, a public Jewish space that would reflect the totality of the Jewish people, and we haven't done that. But this move of not just turning away from Israel, but turning against Israel, this is a red line. So I'm desperately worried about, really, it's a phenomenon that when you and I were growing up seemed inconceivable. Jewish anti-Zionism died in the Shoah. There were pockets, Satmar and the Neturei Karta, the ultra-Orthodox world had pockets of anti-Zionism. But to think that normative American Jews would hold an anti-Zionist position, that was over. That ideological argument had been won decisively by Zionism. And yet here we are, fighting anti-Zionism. So that's the first thing that worries me. But I'm worried about something, in a sense, even deeper than that, or more a broader phenomenon, and that is the what I would call the return of the American Jewish whisper. When I was growing up, and I imagine you'll identify with this as well, when my parents or their friends were in a public non-Jewish space and they said the word Jew, they would lower their voice. Didn't matter what the topic. You didn't speak about Jewish issues publicly, freely. You certainly didn't light Hanukkah menorahs in the public square. That was not the American Jewish community that I knew in the 1960s. By the 1980s, and certainly 1990s, American Jews had lost their whisper. They had really begun to feel completely at home in America. What anti-Zionism, what the return of anti-Zionism is doing in progressive spaces, where most young American Jews live, is returning the Jewish whisper. And I experience this when I go to campuses. I was on a Midwestern campus just a couple months ago, walking with a group of Jewish students on the quad, and one of them mentioned Israel, and her voice lowered. I said, I haven't heard that, since Jack Ruby killed Harvey Oswald. There's the American Jewish whisper. And when I mention this to friends, American Jewish friends, they corroborate that. They say, one rabbi was telling me, I have a friend who's a professor at Yale, and we were out having dinner, and he mentioned Israel, and his voice went down. And so the return of the American Jewish whisper. And that is a mortal threat to the vitality and self-confidence of the next generation of American Jewry. And in that sense, Jonathan, I think that anti-Zionism is a much greater threat to American Jewry than it is to Israel. BDS does not harm the Israeli economy. The Israeli economy, if you look at the last 20 years of BDS, our economy has just grown exponentially. Just in the last year, investment in the Israeli high-tech sector has doubled. So BDS is a total failure in relation to Israel. But its real threat is the intimidation factor in the diaspora.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. You've also written about another Jewish response to anti-Semitism. While the left seems to encourage anti-Zionism, the virus of Kahanism seems to have more influence today than ever and seems to have been essentially mainstreamed. Yeah. Is that reversible, or is the presence of neo-Kahanists in the Knesset now just as much of an inevitability as that of Islamists and Palestinian nationalists representing Arab voters?
Look, we've always had a Kahanist fringe. Every society has its haters. The miracle of Israeli society was that the far right wasn't a more substantial force, given the fact that we're under relentless pressure, threat, terror. We go from terror to war to siege. And the fact that Kahanism didn't strike deeper roots in the society is really, I think, a deep testimony to the basic moral health of Israel. What changed in the last year or so was the political legitimization of Kahanism, and that's the gift of Netanyahu. Netanyahu, in his last iteration, in his desperate iteration, has been prepared to break all the rules, political, moral, even to my mind, security, risk Israel in multiple ways, and legitimizing Kahanism has been one of the worst legacies that he's leaving Israel. And now that Kahanism has been embraced as legitimate not only by a part of religious Zionism, but by the Likud itself. If you listen to the rhetoric in the Likud today, there's not that much difference between the Likud and the so-called party, the so-called religious Zionist party of Smotrich and Ben Gvir, the far-right Kahanist religious Zionist alliance. And it's spreading into the mainstream. The legitimization of the rhetoric of hatred. I took a taxi last night, and I asked the driver, so, how are you doing with Corona? And he says, well, Corona is not the biggest problem here. So I already knew what was coming. Okay, what's the biggest problem? The biggest problem is that we have a government of traitors, and I wish for Naftali Bennett the most painful death imaginable. Sharon's 7 years of coma should be 70 years of coma for Bennett. This is Naftali Bennett, for God's sake. And what was most scary to me was that this guy was not a raving lunatic. He was very intelligent, and he was speaking very calmly, very quietly. And so there is a legitimization of the language of treason, of hatred, not just disagreement with your opponents, but real hatred. We haven't seen this since the 90s. And again, I don't think it's a mass phenomenon, but I'm very worried, very worried.
Looking at the issue of sort of dialogue from a different angle, Imam Abdullah Amtepli, your colleague in the Shalom Hartman Institute's Muslim Leadership Initiative, was vocal about the latest evidence that CARE, which claims to be a civil rights group representing the interests of American Muslims in the United States, represents only about 10% of Muslims. But in spite of that, and groups with similar extremist agendas seems to have a near monopoly on Muslim leadership in America. As a leading advocate and practitioner of interfaith dialogue, how is it going to be possible to move forward towards the goal of interfaith understanding or to combat the forces of hatred when groups like CARE still seem to be the main dialogue partners of choice and to produce conversations that do little but to widen the gap between communities rather than bridging it?
Well, about 10 years ago, Abdullah came to me with an idea, which was to create a program that would teach young, emerging Muslim American leaders about Judaism, Israel, and Zionism. And, he said, my goal is not to create Muslim Zionists. My goal is to help the future leaders of the American Muslim community understand their American Jewish neighbors better, understand that Judaism isn't only a religion, it's also a people, a nation with a connection to a land, and the intersection between these components of Jewish identity. Let's create a program. And we did. That's the Hartman program, the Muslim Leadership Initiative. We've had now 150 people coming through the program, including some leading young journalists, writers, religious leaders, communal leaders, a fantastic group of people. We're planning on our next cohort, which will be our largest yet, 30 people. And this is really the outcome of Abdullah's vision to address directly the question that you raise, which is who's going to challenge the monopoly of CARE and some other groups like CARE that speak for the Muslim American community. And so Abdullah's idea was to try to create an alternative Muslim American leadership. That was really his goal, and that's a very ambitious goal. I have no way of measuring how close we are to achieving something of Abdullah's vision. My sense is that it's really a generational struggle, and we won't know until it will probably be too late for me. But hopefully, the next generation will see the results. And what we have tried to do is make a long-term investment in the relationship. And Abdullah's great fear, as an American Muslim, was bringing the European model of Muslim-Jewish relations, importing that into America, the French model. And Abdullah felt that if Muslim Americans turn actively against their Jewish neighbors, it will destroy the American Muslim community, because America is not France, and America won't tolerate that kind of assault. And so, as Abdullah always emphasized to me, I'm not doing this because I love Jews. I'm doing this because I love Muslims. And I want Islam to grow, and I want the American Muslim community to be a model of a different kind of Islam in the modern world. And so we've put in now close to 10 years of work, and very proud of the project.
Yeah, I think you're right that it's generational. Who knows where that will lead, but I think that's an important effort to at least attempt. Let me bring you back to internal Jewish issues. One of the most daunting challenges facing Israel is the divide between the Haredi community and the rest of Israel. Many Israeli voters are eager to see the power of the Haredim diminished in terms of their influence over government and their monopoly over so much of the country's societal infrastructure in terms of marriage, divorce, and kashrut, not to mention the long-standing grievance over the exemption of ultra-Orthodox men from the military draft. Yet, in spite of the fact that the current coalition left the Haredi parties in the opposition, both Bennett and Lapid seem in some ways to be just as wary of picking a fight with them, even on issues where the majority of the country would be with them, right, or on issues of concern to American Jews like the Western Wall and religious pluralism, as Netanyahu was when he had them in the cabinet. So where does that go?
Well, if I understand the approach of this government, and one thing actually that I'd like to just preface my answer to you with is that this government is notable in two ways. First of all, as we began the conversation, it is it models an extraordinary range of political and cultural diversity. Almost every sector, major sector of Israeli society is represented. Even for the first time in Israel's history, the Arab sector is part of the coalition. There's one sector of Israeli society that is not in this government, and that's the Haredim. And let's even magnify the irony by noting that this is the first government ever headed by an Orthodox Jew. So what that says to me is that the main divide in Israel today, with the main divide within Jewish Israel, is between the Haredim and almost everyone else. That's a big change from the religious secular divide of Israel's earlier years. Something really profound is shifting. And the fact that Meretz can sit with Yamina in the same government, Bennett can sit with the far left secular, ultra secular Meretz party, but Bennett can't sit with the Haredim. This is a major statement, and I hope that the Haredi community is internalizing this, because what this government represents is a growing consensus among Jewish Israelis that the status quo in relationship with the Haredim is unsustainable. And it's unsustainable not only ideologically, which I believe it is unsustainable for Israel to remain a Zionist state and a modern state and have this relationship. It's also literally, pragmatically unsustainable. We will not be able to continue carrying the Haredi community indefinitely. Either they will break or we will break, but this is not going to continue for another generation. So this is an opportunity now to re-examine the relationship, especially after the last 2 years of COVID, when the Haredi community often acted as a state within a state, creating its own health guidelines regardless of the impact on Israeli society, regardless of the impact on the hospitals. And so there's a tremendous residue of anger, but more than anger is a passing emotion. I sense more and more Israelis feel something has to change. Now, so the question is, and this goes back to really the point you're making, why aren't we seeing a more radical break,
or at least some movement,
this government? We are seeing movement. First of all, the fact that they're not in the government, and proving to the Haredi community that we actually can get by politically without them. That's a big statement. But the second major move that this government made, and it did it immediately, was to seriously cut back on the subsidies for large families. And the purpose for that was to pressure Haredi young men into joining the workforce. The second move, related move that the government did, was to lower the age allowing young Haredim to join the workforce even if they haven't done the army. Because until now, the cutoff was age 24, which meant that Haredim had to stay in yeshiva till the age of 24 before trying to join the workforce. By age 24, most Haredi young men are married with one or two children. And so to then try to join the workforce, learning a skill, is that much harder. And so this government has decided to take a much more subtle approach, which is not frontally confrontational, but to create the conditions to encourage even pressure, economically pressure, Haredi young men to join the workforce, lowering the age. I believe the age now is 20. At the age of 20, you don't have to go to the army. Now, that's a very painful concession. You know, it feels so, it sullies the sacrifice of our kids. It just doesn't sit right. But I understand why the government has made that decision, and I think that it was the right move. So what the government is trying to do now is through a combination of incentives and pressure rather than frontal assault. And look, we know that the Haredi community, they are the world champions in resisting pressure. They survived the Holocaust. They survived Stalinism. They survived Western assimilation. The Haredim, you can't pressure them. And I also don't want to fight the Haredim. They're a precious part of the Jewish people. And they are an essential part of who we are. And what they preserve is something that most of the Jewish people has lost in modernity, which is a profound commitment to sanctity. Even in the modern Orthodox world, I wouldn't say that sanctity is at the top of the agenda. In the Haredi world, at its best, I don't want to romanticize the Haredim, but at its best, there is a commitment to sanctity, to the purity of the intense religious life that has been lost in most of the rest of the Jewish people. And I don't want to lose that. But at the same time, I can't continue carrying the entire Haredi community the way we are now. I literally can't afford to do it. And so we need to find a compromise between how do we continue to enable this precious resource, spiritual resource, to thrive without threatening the long-term, and not so long-term, viability of the state of Israel. Because we are approaching that moment. And that we cannot allow to happen.
Right. Let me switch from issues to your status as an author. Can you tell us what the next book you're working on is and what it will be about?
It's about the wisdom of Jewish survival and looking at the starting point of the book is the question: how did we make the transition from the lowest point in our history, which was May 1945, when the camps were open, to today, which is arguably the peak point of Jewish power, significance on the world stage, probably in our history? How did we do it? And we take that for granted, and I want to slow the process down, and I want to look at it. And my answer, this is a much more complicated question, but the short answer to that question is that it was the post-Holocaust alliance of Zionism and the American Jewish community, the two flags that are on the bima of most American synagogues. Those are the two flags of the Jewish, that symbolize the Jewish defeat of the Shoah, the Jewish defeat of Hitler. And so I want to play that out. And then the next question of the book is, how do we ensure the continued vitality of these two flags and what they represent, the American Jewish community in the state of Israel and the relationship between them? And how do we ensure that we have the conceptual tools to deal with the threats that we're facing, both from without and also from within? And we've spoken about some of these threats.
Well, that sounds enticing to me as a reader. It is ambitious, but we'll be looking forward to that, and hopefully have you on to discuss it once, God willing, it's in print. Yossi, thank you so much for your insights and perspective. We want to thank you for your time, and we want to thank our audience. Whether you're listening to us on Spotify or any of the other podcast platforms, or watching us on the JNS YouTube channel or on JBS TV, please like and or subscribe to Top Story and give us good reviews. Please let us know where you listen or watch the show and what you think about it. And see you next week.